Voyage back, page 212. Bewildered by the nightmarish suddenness with which he had been pitched into the ocean and had the dinghy torn out of his grasp and flung into the turbulent darkness, Jim had dived clumsily into the water and struck out after it. He took 6 or 7 strong strokes and saw no sign of the dinghy, when its rubber hull bumped the back of the head, as if teasing him. He grabbed a trailing line just as another wave rolled indifferently over him. He found he could stand, and, holding the dinghy and bracing himself for the next wave, called out into darkness, "I've got it! Over here!" There was no answer, and Jim could see neither the boat nor Neil. He shouted again, "Neil! I've got it! Over here!" "Jim!" came an answering yell from off to his left and slightly closer to the shore. Jim began struggling through the water toward where the voice seemed to come from, and was startled when a huge fish splashed almost on top of him. "Help me!" he heard Neil's voice say, and realised that it was Neil. He reached out with his free hand and grabbed hold of him. After a wave passed, Neil suddenly stood up, choking and gasping for breath and clinging to Jim. "My arm!" he said, grimacing. "My elbow's killing me. I can't use it." The two men stood in 3 feet of water and braced themselves as another hill of water swept over them, slamming them a foot closer to shore. "I'll hold it now," Jim grasped. "You get in." "Get in!" he shouted. In a lull between the waves, Jim quickly hauled himself over one side of the dinghy and plopped into the middle. It was filled with 5 or 6 inches of water. He got to his knees. He heard Neil shout, "Start the engine!" He turned around and groped for the release lever that would lower the prop into the water. A wave smashed into the dinghy, jerking it sideways, and spilled Jim over against the left side and almost overboard. He struggled to his knees again and groped for the lever. When he found it, the engine fell with an abruptness that pinched his first finger, and he gasped out a Franklin-like oath as he pulled back his hand and grabbed the starting cord. He jerked it once, but the engine didn't start. "Start the engine!" Neil shouted from someplace in the water near the bow. Jim remembered the second time to pull out the choke and tried again. No catch. Again. The engine sputtered and died. Again. No catch. Again. Sputter. Sputter. He pushed the choke in. Roar! The engine came to life. "Help me in!" Neil shouted, now bobbing upright beside the dinghy, and he could only throw one arm over the bulge of inflated rubber. "Grab the back of my belt!" As Jim throttled down the outboard, another wave broke over them and smashed them into even shallower water. Neil was then in only 2 or 3 feet of water, and his torso fell across the starboard side of the dinghy, permitting Jim to grab his belt and haul with all his strength to get him in and up. The next wave seemed to scoop Neil up and splash him down into the pool in the bottom of the swamped inflatable. Jim shifted into forward and pulled out the throttle. The outboard roared, and the dinghy exploded against the next wave, ploughing partly through it like a submarine rather than over it, then surging through the next 15 feet of calm water before exploding through the next wave. Even with the 2 men aboard and 6 inches of water, the dinghy was able to nose forward at 4 or 5 knots. Jim had no sense of direction, except the impulse to get out of the surf and back into deeper water. Crouched low in the plunging dinghy, he couldn't see any channel lights, and had only the vaguest idea of which way was west. "Steer by the swells!" Neil shouted to him, kneeling beside Jim in the middle of the dinghy, one arm limp and held awkwardly in front of him. "Keep them coming at you on the port beam!" Jim had been heading into them, but as soon as Neil spoke, he realised that their destination was simply straight across the swells at a right angle. He swung the dinghy to starboard, squinted into the rain and spray, and steered at full throttle to where he hoped to find Vagabond. A giant white eye suddenly peered at them from almost dead ahead, then swept away to the right. The Coast Guard cutter was coming directly at them. "Strange going on here. Launch reports there's no radio aboard the Moon Chaser." Captain Ollie heard shouts from up on deck and felt something thud against one side of the Vagabond. "Okay, Fort Macon," the voice from the Avenger went on. "We're leaving our launch here to check for survivors, but Avenger is now resuming normal patrol duties. Something's not kosher about this. Over." Captain Ollie hurried up the cabin steps and bumped into Frank, who was scrambling across the wheelhouse to get to the controls and get Vagabond moving. Jim and Neil were barely visible in the darkness, hauling up the dinghy into the starboard cockpit. "Coast Guard's coming back," he said to Frank, who simply gave him a wild look and put Vagabond into full ahead. Neil stumbled into the wheelhouse and collapsed with a groan on the cushioned seat. Jean followed and knelt beside him, and then called Macklin over. Captain Ollie went to help Jim with the dinghy. He was pulling it off the open deck aft, up over the cockpit seat and into the cockpit. After the two of them had got it down into the cockpit, Jim asked, "Can we leave it here for now?" "Sure, I'll lash it down," Captain Ollie said. "Go help your dad." Jim took a long stride over the slightly squashed inflatable, went into the wheelhouse and stood beside his father. Jean ducked past them into the main cabin, and then Jim leaned out to peer ahead into the rain. They were motoring at full speed south along the western side of the inlet, heading directly out to sea. They were already far into the right of the big ship channel and pounding into the steep swells that rolled directly at them. Jim's glance at the depth meter told him it read 4 feet, which meant they were in only 7 or 8 feet of water. Vagabond, with a dagger board up but heavily loaded, probably drew a little less than 4 feet. There was a terrific slam and shudder as a big breaking wave smacked into all 3 hulls at once. Vagabond slowed seemingly to a halt and then surged forward again. "Have we passed the point yet?" Frank shouted at Jim. "Look out your side!" Jim stared out into the blackness off to his right, remembering that the point on which old Fort McCone and the Coast Guard station were located was the last land to starboard before the open ocean. He thought he could see a few lights, probably the Coast Guard station slightly aft of their starboard beam. "I see lights at about 4 o'clock, he said to his father. "I can't see anything directly abeam." Another breaking wave crashed into the trimaran, slowing her almost to a halt before she recovered and made good headway again. 2 feet. "Dad!" Jim shouted to his father when he saw the depth meter flicker at 2 feet, then 0, then 3, then 0. 0 feet! White-faced and grimacing, Frank swung the wheel to get Vagabond around towards the channel in deeper water, but also back towards the Coast Guard cutter. "It's just turbulence," Neil shouted from them behind. "Does it stay steady at 1 or 0, he asked. "It stays 0 now," Jim said, frightened, "and just occasionally 2 or 3. "It's turbulence," Neil said, staggering up between Jim and Frank to look at the controls, while Jean seemed to be trying to hold something against his arm. "We could swing her southwest now, away from the cutter." "I'm not running her aground," Frank said urgently, holding his course back towards the channel. He stared down first at the depth meter, which was fluctuating erratically between 0 and now 4 or 5 feet, and then at the compass, which showed them on a southwest heading. "We're free, Frank," Neil insisted, grimacing in pain. "We're out of the inlet. Head her southwest, even west. They'll see us if we stay on this course." Frank, frowning, his face, like all the others, wet with rain and sweat, looked once briefly, fearfully at Neil. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Head her west." 6 feet, Jim announced. Frank turned the wheel back to the right, and Vagabond swung starboard, first heading south, then southwest, where Frank straightened her out. As they surged into the blackness, taking the swells now on their port side, Jim took a long look aft and saw the light sweep along Fort McCone Point, then out towards them. A white beam blinded him as the wheelhouse filled with light, and then the light moved out to sea. None of those standing in the wheelhouse spoke, and Neil joined Jim in watching the subsequent movement of the light. "They didn't see us," Neil said quietly. "Take her full west, Frank." "I'll keep her on southwest," Frank said, not looking at him. "I tell you, we're free," Neil shouted. Frank didn't answer. 5 feet, said Jim. All 3 men now looked at the depth meter, which held at 5 feet for a few more seconds and then went on to 6, 7 and then 10 feet. Frank eased the wheel a little to starboard, and slowly the boat swung more to the west, until, after half a minute, Frank steadied her at 260 degrees, 10 degrees south of west. And again the light, less bright now, exploded into the wheelhouse as the distant cutter swept the sea with its searchlight. Again it did not hesitate or return to Vagabond, which sliced and ploughed away at full speed. For 2 or 3 more minutes the depth meter read between 10 and 12 feet, and then began climbing rapidly through the teens. Indeed, they were free.